All right, here we go. So this is Taryn and Mia, and they are walking towards art. I took them yesterday, and the light was good, and we had some shadows. So um, first of all, I'm gonna just crop it a little bit because it's a little bit weirdly arranged, and I really want the emphasis to be on the shadow. So in fact, what we could do is we could actually make them anonymous, make it more about the shadows here. And that sort of draws our attention to the shadow if that's what you want. So that's what we're going to do now. Um, Now, the easiest shadow of the two to sort of demarcate will definitely be Terran. So let's just close up on this one here. So something that you could do straight away is just auto tone it a little bit. You see if my darks are a little bit darker now. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a special tool called the clone stamp. Looks like a little joystick there. And the clone stamp tool works in a special way is that you demarcate an area pressing Alt, like a target area, and it recreates that same effect somewhere else. Now I've got this on opacity that's quite low, but it works best if it's nearly almost to the top, but not quite. And it'll be obvious little Y. So and I can change the size obviously. I want to do this quickly, but basically, as you can see, there's a little target area that I'm referring to, and it's reproducing that. If you go too far, though, it'll just reproduce things like crazy. So you really got to take it easy and choose different areas. So I'm reproducing gravel, so it's fairly easy for me. Um, you got to take it step by step though, because if you do it all in one go, you will get a weird kind of effect going on, and it will be obvious from far away. Okay, now as you can see, as I'm getting close to her feet, that's obviously going to be the hardest part. But I don't necessarily need to erase everything. So in actual fact, I might keep that much. I might keep that much. Now the other thing is that I've opened up this SVG. It's kind of like operates like a PNG, and it's this little. It's the Sully from Monsters Inc. So what I'm going to do is after I've found the werewolf or monster or whatever you want to do, or angel or whatever, or someone else's shadow, you're going to put it into here. Now it's way, way, way bigger. So obviously I'm going to go Control T. I'm going to decrease the size of it a lot. I don't know quite how much yet, but it's not just the size we're going to change. There we go. It's getting a bit more realistic. There we go. Now, the basic idea is that we're going to place this at the feet of Terran. So I'm going to Control T again, or Command T if you're on an Apple, and I can shift it a little bit. But that's still not going to look like a good shadow. So basically what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to get the feet in a basic area and try to think about stretching it out a little bit. I don't need to hold down shift anymore because like it's all going to change, but um, I'll just put it back to its original. So I'll just keep it there for a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go into edit transform. And in transform, it's a great one. Well, there's lots of them. Like so, scale obviously is just the size of it. Rotate obviously is rotation, but you can do that anyway when you have it on free transform. So I don't even know why that's there. But I want to talk about these other ones like skew. So skewing, obviously you can tell that's going to create an effect that we're kind of going for. Because if you look at Mia's shadow, the reason I chose two people is that I can look at a realistic shadow and I can look at an unrealistic shadow. So skewing is useful, but that's not quite right. So although it's not that far off, I guess. Um, and for the dramatic effect of it, I'm going to try to go a little bit overboard with it, obviously. But basically, if you want me to describe skew, is the top lines, the top two lines, and the bottom two lines, their relationship to each other can change, as can these ones. All right. So while I was doing that, I actually didn't do too bad a job at doing that. I usually use that in conjunction with something else. So Oh, well, actually, before I do anything else, just let's talk about layers for a second. So basically what I've done here is I've gotten rid of Taryn's shadow, right? So she doesn't have a shadow anymore. And there's this other layer, which is the monster shadow. It's a little bit of smudge and bluff, a little bit. So distort is another one. Obviously that's going to be quite dramatic, but maybe a little bit unrealistic. It operates in a slightly different way than skew, but it's quite similar, really. And the last one, oh no, it's the last two, perspective, which might be useful as well. But I've actually already perspectived it in a way, so I'm not gonna. I was more happy with it being like that actually. And the last one is warp, which is really crazy if you really want to move things around a little bit. It moves a little bit like the ink tool, I guess, really warping things around and folding it, but unnecessary today. So I'm going to not choose it. So let's just say I found out a nice look that I was going to go for. I will change that ever so slightly. I think that I could make that side bigger. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to put it basically where her feet are going to be, over the top of that shadow. And now if I just go here with my opacity, I'm going to turn that down a little bit, and I can see where the shadow is. Let's just close up on that so we know what we're talking about. Um, so here's the shadow, and here's the real shadow. So I don't need it where I've got a real one. So I'm going to delete it around here, there. Well, there's lots of different ways to do this, but I'm just going to use this one because I was just using it before. You have to be aware of what you're cutting and what you're not cutting. And that too. All right. So I can move this down a little bit. Just being aware of what you're doing can be a little bit confusing at times, and get rid of that too. All right, cool. Okay, so I'm liking that shape. Now, obviously, it looks a little bit like a shadow just by decreasing the opacity a bit, but it's a bit too sharp. Um, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to blend the two together, and I'm going to use the blurring tool, and I'm going to do it on the background here. So even though this is very, very, very subtle, sort of like move, mainly because of what I'm using here. What's happening here, if we just turn that off for a second, is that it's blurring those edges, and that's really what I want to do. And also smudging it as well, although that is a little bit more obvious. Move the strength down for that a little bit, a lot. The bad thing about using the smudge tool is it also gets rid of the cool texture as well, between the two. But smudging them into each other is really the key here. And as you can see, like the overlap is where it's really not working at this point. But that's okay because I can increase the opacity to meet that. Okay. Um, so what I can do with this is that I can just sort of concentrate on this one, and I can sort of like do a little bit of clone stamping, I guess, to sort of like get rid of those areas that I don't want it to be really obvious in. And then just like blur those into the next one. And then a little bit more blurring. But anyway, I've only got a little bit of time to do this, so I'm not going to get too worried about that. So the other thing that you can do to make this look more like a shadow is you can blur the tops of the shadow. So you can see the shadow is quite blurry by itself. So um, what would be good to do would be to blur sort of like the tips of it, but with a much larger brush. just to make sure that you're not making things too distinct. And that can be done in a um, very obvious way. Or instead, you can take the whole layer and do it that way. But the important thing is that to have another shadow next to it so that you really know what you're going to do. So if I were to take a little bit more time over it, I'd obviously worry about the overlap between the two. I think it makes sense to have the feet of the person come out first and just sort of blend between the two very slowly. Obviously, in terms of opacity, that's a really dark shadow. That's ridiculous. But you really want to see a little bit coming through. I mean, even the darkest of shadows. Again, like it's not never too late to change the size of it or the length or whatever. The only thing I will say is that you have to be very careful of is that when you come to, if you were to have this on another angle, you must change the angle of the shadow when it reaches that other angle. So when it hits a wall, for example, obviously the opacity is going to change. So that was at 32, so I'm going to move this to 32. That I want to keep the same, but the angle of it will differ. And so then, because it's going to hit that wall in a different way, so obviously when I'm going to skew it, I could come it back this way just to give a more realistic effect. But the most important thing is that you sort of are aware of what normal shadows are doing. Now you can see a little bit more of that sort of blur effect I was doing. So it's quite a long process to really blur the two between. Um, but you will get it eventually. It may just take a little bit of time. So I think that's probably a good size to work with. Um, it's really just the blurring of the real shadow into the fake shadow that you really need to work on. But you'll figure it out eventually, and blurring the edges is really important, but not so much that you can't see that it's the monster that you kind of like going for. Cool. So I hope that helped.